They thought a black pastor could be ruined before breakfast, but by sunrise, every lie they planted inside that church would lead federal agents straight to their door. The baptism water was still trembling in the silver basin when the front doors of New Hope Baptist Church burst open and Sheriff Cole Whitaker marched down the center aisle like he owned the house of God. Behind him came Deputy Grant Miller and 3 uniformed officers, their boots striking the old wooden floor hard enough to silence the choir. Pastor Elijah Brooks stood near the pulpit in his white robe, one hand resting on the shoulder of a 14-year-old boy who had just stepped out of the baptism pool. The congregation turned in shock. Mothers pulled children closer. Elderly men rose halfway from their seats, then froze when they saw Whitaker's hand resting near his belt. The sheriff smiled as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice cutting through the sanctuary. "This church is now part of a criminal investigation." Pastor Brooks did not run. He did not shout. He simply stepped in front of the boy and looked down the aisle at the sheriff with a calm that made the room feel even colder. "Sheriff," he said, "you are interrupting a baptism." Whitaker gave a short laugh and looked around at the stained glass windows, the worn hymnals, the wooden cross hanging above the pulpit. "Looks more like a hiding place to me." A murmur moved through the congregation, but Pastor Brooks lifted one hand, asking them to stay peaceful. That only made Whitaker's smile wider. He had mistaken restraint for fear. He had mistaken dignity for weakness. Deputy Miller moved toward the pastor's office without being asked, already knowing where to go, already reaching for the drawer where the evidence was supposed to be found. What he did not notice was the small red light blinking above the hallway door. What he did not know was that Sister Ruth Caldwell had installed a second camera after someone broke into the donation room 3 weeks earlier. Every step Miller took was being recorded. Every glance between him and the sheriff was being saved. A minute later, Miller came back holding a sealed bag of cash, a small packet of white powder, and an old pistol wrapped in cloth. Gasps filled the church. Whitaker turned toward the congregation with the satisfied face of a man unveiling a performance. "Pastor Elijah Brooks," he said loudly, "you are under arrest for possession of illegal narcotics, illegal weapons, and laundering money through a church charity." The boy beside Elijah began to shake. Pastor Brooks gently moved him behind Sister Ruth and held out his wrists. "Do what you came to do," he said. The sheriff stepped close, lowering his voice so only the first few pews could hear. "I told you to stop making trouble in my town." Elijah looked at the badge on Whitaker's chest, then into his eyes. "And I told you the truth has witnesses." Whitaker snapped the cuffs around the pastor's wrists, the cold metal clicking in the middle of the sanctuary. Children cried. Phones rose quietly in the pews. The choir stood frozen beneath the stained glass image of dawn breaking over a river. Sheriff Whitaker thought he had just buried a black pastor in front of his own congregation. What he did not know was that Pastor Brooks had a son in Atlanta watching a federal case come together piece by piece. And before the next sunrise touched the church steps, that son would lead the FBI raid that ended Sheriff Whitaker's kingdom for good. Long before Sheriff Whitaker tried to turn a sanctuary into a crime scene, Pastor Elijah Brooks had begun that Sunday the same way he began almost every Sunday, before the sun had fully climbed over Ashford, Georgia. At 5:30 in the morning, while most of the town still slept behind drawn curtains, Elijah was already standing behind New Hope Baptist Church with a broom in his hand, sweeping pine needles from the back steps. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered but gentle in his movements, with silver beginning to show in his beard and deep lines around his eyes that made him look stern until he smiled. He wore a dark suit that had been pressed the night before, polished black shoes, and a plain gold wedding ring he still wore even after losing his wife 6 years earlier. Nothing about him announced power. Nothing about him looked dangerous. To anyone passing by, he was just a black pastor preparing for another Sunday service in a small southern town that had learned to ignore men like him until it needed prayers, food, or forgiveness. But Elijah noticed things most people missed. He noticed the tire marks near the alley behind the church, too fresh to belong to the delivery van. He noticed one of the side windows had been wiped clean from the outside, though no one from the church had touched it. He noticed the way a patrol cruiser rolled slowly past the corner at exactly 6:12, then again at 6:19, never stopping, never waving, only watching. He did not panic. He did not call anyone yet. He simply looked toward the street, held the broom still for a moment, and let the plate number settle in his memory the way Scripture settled in his heart. His calm was not fear. It was discipline, sharpened by years of shepherding people through storms they never deserved. Inside the church, the building smelled of old wood, floor wax, coffee, and the faint sweetness of flowers Sister Ruth Caldwell had arranged near the pulpit. Elijah unlocked the front doors himself, checked the donation box, adjusted the thermostat, and walked row by row through the sanctuary, straightening hymnals that did not need straightening. He paused at the baptism pool and rested one hand on the rail. That morning, 14-year-old Jamal Turner was going to be baptized. 6 months earlier, Jamal had been skipping school and sleeping in the back room of a closed laundromat while his mother worked double shifts at a diner off Highway 41. Elijah had found him there during a food delivery run, not with judgment, not with threats, but with a hot meal and a quiet question: "Son, when was the last time somebody asked what you needed instead of what you did wrong?" Since then, Jamal had been coming to youth nights every Wednesday. He was not perfect. None of them were. But he was trying. That was enough for Elijah. By 7 o'clock, Sister Ruth arrived carrying a tin of biscuits and a ring of keys large enough to sound like church bells when she walked. She was 67, sharp-eyed, and loyal in the way only people who had buried too many friends and still chosen hope could be loyal. She found Elijah near the office, reading over a folder of handwritten notes. "You are here early again," she said. "The Lord keeps sending me work before breakfast," Elijah replied, closing the folder. Ruth glanced at it, then at him. "That the complaint file?" Elijah gave a small nod. The folder held names, dates, photographs, receipts, copies of statements, and careful notes from families who said Sheriff Whitaker's department had stopped them without cause, searched their cars, threatened their sons, or made money disappear after arrests that never became charges. Elijah had not built the file because he wanted trouble. He had built it because people kept coming to him after everyone else refused to listen. Mothers came with shaking hands. Fathers came embarrassed by tears they could not hold back. Young men came angry because no one believed them. Elijah wrote everything down. Not because paper was powerful by itself, but because lies hated records. "You still sending it to Atlanta?" Ruth asked softly. Elijah slipped the folder into the lower drawer of his desk and locked it. "When the time is right." Ruth studied his face. "And does Daniel know?" The name hung in the office for a second longer than ordinary names should. Elijah looked toward the framed photograph on the shelf beside his Bible. In it, his son Daniel Brooks stood beside him outside the church after his mother's funeral, wearing a black suit, his face composed, his eyes carrying grief behind a wall of control. To the congregation, Daniel was simply Elijah's son who had moved to Atlanta for government work. Elijah had never corrected them, and Daniel had never asked him to. Privacy was part of the job. So was patience. "Daniel knows enough," Elijah said. Ruth lowered her voice. "That boy always knows more than he says." Elijah almost smiled. "He gets that from his mother." A little after 8, the first volunteers arrived. Elijah helped carry boxes from the pantry to the fellowship hall, where they packed grocery bags for families who would pick them up after service. Canned beans, rice, peanut butter, cereal, diapers, soap. He checked each bag like it mattered, because to him it did. When Mrs. Alvarez came and worried that her electric bill was due Tuesday, Elijah wrote the amount on a yellow sticky note and placed it inside his Bible. When an older veteran named Mr. Colson tried to hide that his hands were trembling too badly to button his coat, Elijah stepped beside him and helped without making him feel small. When Jamal arrived with his mother, nervous in a white shirt a size too big, Elijah knelt just enough to look him in the eye. "You ready?" Jamal swallowed. "I think so." "Thinking so is enough for the first step," Elijah told him. "God can work with honest feet." By 9 o'clock, the choir began warming up, and the church filled with the layered sounds of Sunday, children laughing, ushers greeting families, coffee cups touching tables, old friends calling each other by names nobody else used anymore. Elijah moved through it all without hurry. He shook hands. He remembered birthdays. He asked about medical appointments. He noticed who was missing. He noticed who was pretending to be fine. That was his gift. He could stand in a crowded room and still see the person trying not to be seen. But beneath that kindness was something steadier than gentleness alone. When a side door opened too quickly, Elijah turned before anyone else did. When an unfamiliar man stepped into the back of the sanctuary and pretended to check his phone, Elijah saw the outline of a county-issued radio beneath his jacket. When a white pickup slowed outside the stained glass windows, he did not look long, but he saw enough. He had lived in Ashford too long to confuse coincidence with warning. At 9:18, his phone buzzed once inside his jacket pocket. He stepped into the hallway and looked at the screen. The message came from a secure number saved only as DB. It read, "Do not confront anyone today. Preserve everything. I will call after service." Elijah stared at the words for a moment, then locked the phone and slid it away. He did not tell Ruth. He did not alarm the congregation. He simply walked to the small utility closet near the choir room and checked the backup recorder. Sister Ruth had installed after the donation room break-in. The red light blinked steadily. Recording. Elijah stood there in the quiet hallway, listening to the muffled hymn rising from the sanctuary, and whispered a prayer that was not for safety alone. It was for restraint. For wisdom. For the strength not to become what hated him. Then he returned to the pulpit as the first notes of the opening song lifted through the church. The people saw their pastor smiling, calm, present, ordinary. They saw a man ready to baptize a child and preach about grace. They did not see the patrol cars circling 3 blocks away. They did not know about the folder locked in his drawer, or the cameras watching from silent corners, or the federal case moving somewhere beyond the town limits. And Pastor Elijah Brooks, standing beneath the wooden cross with his Bible open before him, did not look like a man preparing for war. He looked like a man who had already decided the truth did not need to shout to survive. By the time the church bells began ringing across Ashford that morning, Sheriff Cole Whitaker was already standing in his office with a cup of black coffee in one hand and Pastor Elijah Brooks's name written in red marker across a file folder on his desk. The sheriff's office sat less than 2 miles from New Hope Baptist Church, a low brick building with a faded American flag outside and a framed photograph of Whitaker shaking hands with the governor hanging in the lobby. To people passing through town, it looked respectable. To the people who lived under it, it felt like a locked door with no handle. Whitaker had been sheriff for 18 years, long enough for children to grow up knowing his patrol cars by sound, long enough for mothers to lower their voices when his name came up, long enough for complaints against his department to vanish into drawers no one was allowed to open. He was 52 years old, square-jawed, broad in the shoulders, with gray at his temples and the practiced smile of a man who knew exactly when to look friendly for cameras. At church fundraisers, town parades, and county board meetings, he called everyone neighbor. Behind closed doors, he called the south side of Ashford the problem. That was where most of the black families lived. That was where New Hope Baptist stood. And that was where Pastor Elijah Brooks had become something Whitaker could not control. For years, Whitaker had ruled Ashford through small humiliations that never looked large enough to make the evening news. A traffic stop that lasted 40 minutes because a young black man looked nervous. A search that somehow found nothing but left a family's car torn apart on the roadside. A business license delayed because the owner had spoken too loudly at a public meeting. A county grant approved for one neighborhood and denied for another because the paperwork was incomplete. Whitaker understood power in the way men like him often did. Not as a duty, but as a room where he got to decide who stood and who knelt. He did not need to shout all the time. Sometimes all he had to do was let his hand rest on his badge, smile slowly, and remind people that reports could be written many different ways. The badge made him official. The town made him comfortable. Fear made him lazy. And laziness had made him careless. Deputy Grant Miller stood near the window, watching the street outside while turning a toothpick between his fingers. Miller was younger than Whitaker by almost 15 years, but he had learned the sheriff's habits quickly. He laughed at the right jokes, leaned on the right people, and asked no questions when evidence moved from one shelf to another inside the property room. He liked the uniform because it made smaller people look away when he stepped close. He liked the way store clerks straightened up when he walked in. He liked being treated as important in a town where, without the badge, he would have been just another angry man with unpaid bills and a loud voice. On the opposite side of the room, Deputy Ryan Hales sat stiffly at a metal desk, pretending to review patrol logs. Hales was 29, newer to the department, and still young enough to feel his conscience before he buried it. He had seen things he wished he had not seen. Missing cash from seized envelopes. Body camera files marked corrupted after ugly stops. Young men charged with resisting when their only real mistake had been asking why they were being stopped. Hales had told himself each incident was complicated. He had told himself that every department had bad days. But lately, the explanations had started sounding thinner, especially after Pastor Brooks began collecting names. Whitaker opened the folder and looked at the photographs inside. There was Elijah standing outside the courthouse with 3 mothers whose sons had filed complaints. There was Elijah handing food boxes to families after a storm. There was Elijah speaking at a town council meeting, calm, dignified, asking why seized charity funds connected to youth outreach had never been returned. Whitaker hated that calm more than anger. Angry men were easy to label. Angry men could be written up as unstable, aggressive, threatening. But Elijah Brooks did not give him that gift. The pastor spoke softly, kept receipts, wrote dates down, and asked questions in public that made council members shift in their seats. "He is getting too comfortable," Whitaker said, tapping the file. Miller smirked. "Pastor thinks that collar makes him untouchable." Whitaker looked up. "No. He thinks people watching makes him untouchable. There is a difference." The sheriff walked to the wall where a large map of Ashford was pinned beneath plastic. Colored marks circled neighborhoods, businesses, traffic corridors, and properties connected to county funding. The north side had blue pins. The south side had red. New Hope Baptist had 3 red circles around it. To Whitaker, the church was not a sanctuary. It was a leak. People went in scared and came out willing to talk. They gave Elijah documents. They gave him phone videos. They trusted him with details they would never give the sheriff's office. That made him dangerous. Not because he carried a weapon. Not because he raised his voice. Because he remembered. And in a town built on people forgetting what had been done to them, memory was a threat. Whitaker's trouble had started with money, as most of his trouble did. Years earlier, a regional anti-drug grant had brought cash into Ashford for prevention programs, youth outreach, and community safety. On paper, it funded patrol overtime, public workshops, and partnerships with local organizations. In reality, the money moved through friendly contractors, padded invoices, and accounts controlled by men who owed Whitaker favors. New Hope Baptist had been promised a portion for its youth program. The money never arrived. When Elijah asked about it, he was told there had been a clerical delay. When he asked again, he was told to be patient. When he produced copies of county approval forms, Whitaker understood that patience was no longer the pastor's plan. Then came the seized property problem. Cash taken during arrests that never became charges. Phones that disappeared before attorneys could request them. Bags of evidence logged under one case number and later appearing under another. Most people would not understand the pattern. Elijah had started to. Worse, he had found people willing to speak. He has been meeting with that attorney daughter of his, Miller said, glancing back from the window. Maya Brooks. She has been asking around about civil rights filings. Whitaker's mouth tightened. I know who she is. You want me to scare her off? Hales looked up before he could stop himself. Whitaker noticed. So did Miller. The room quieted in a way that made the air feel smaller. Something on your mind, Deputy? Whitaker asked. Hales swallowed. No, sir. Whitaker held his gaze a second too long, then smiled without warmth. Good. Because what we are dealing with is not a pastor. It is a man using a church to turn people against law enforcement. Miller nodded eagerly. Exactly. And if the public sees him for what he really is, Whitaker continued, his little campaign dies before it reaches Atlanta. The word Atlanta made Hales shift slightly. Whitaker saw that too. The sheriff had heard rumors that someone outside the county had been asking questions. Federal questions. Quiet questions. Bank records. Property room audits. Old complaints. He did not know who was behind it, but he knew Elijah had connections somewhere. That was why the pastor had to be discredited fast. A respected man could be believed. A man arrested in his own church with cash and narcotics would spend the rest of his life explaining the photograph. People rarely remembered the correction as clearly as the accusation. Whitaker had built a career on that truth. He closed the folder and turned to Miller. Is the package ready? Miller's smile widened. Logged out from old property under the training disposal list. No one will miss it. The cash? Small bills. Enough to look ugly. Not enough to bring in state auditors right away. Whitaker nodded, pleased. He had always preferred lies that looked simple. A complicated lie invited questions. A simple lie gave people permission to believe what they already wanted to believe. Black church. Cash. Drugs. Gun. That was all some people would need. Hales stared down at the patrol log, his pen frozen above the page. He told himself this was only pressure, only theater, only one of Whitaker's intimidation plays. But the words in the room felt heavier than that. They felt like a line being crossed. Whitaker picked up his hat from the desk and placed it on his head with careful precision. In the mirror beside the filing cabinet, he adjusted the brim until he looked like the version of himself voters trusted, firm, clean, necessary. We go in during service, he said. Full congregation. Full visibility. I want everyone in that church to see what their pastor really is. Miller chuckled. And if he resists? Whitaker's eyes hardened. He will not. Men like Brooks care too much about looking righteous. He will stand there calm and let us do it. That was the mistake at the center of Cole Whitaker's world. He believed calm meant surrender. He believed kindness meant weakness. He believed a badge could turn a lie into truth if it was spoken loudly enough in front of frightened people. As the sheriff led his deputies out into the morning light, patrol cars starting one by one in the parking lot, he felt the old confidence settle over him like armor. He had done this before. He had broken louder men than Elijah Brooks. He had watched complaints disappear, witnesses go quiet, and families accept settlements with trembling hands. He had been protected by silence for so long that he mistook silence for loyalty. But across town, in the corners of a church he had underestimated, cameras were already blinking. In homes all over Ashford, people were already tired of being afraid. And somewhere beyond the county line, the questions Whitaker feared most were no longer rumors. They were becoming warrants. The first real warning came 3 nights before the arrest, when the church was almost empty and the streets outside had gone quiet enough for Pastor Elijah Brooks to hear the old building breathe. Wednesday Bible study had ended at 8:15, and by 8:47 the last family had driven away, their taillights fading beyond the oak trees that lined the parking lot. Elijah remained behind, as he often did, stacking folding chairs in the fellowship hall and checking the pantry shelves for Friday distribution. Sister Ruth had already gone home after reminding him twice to lock the side door, and the sanctuary lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. The church felt peaceful at that hour, not silent exactly, but settled, as if the prayers spoken inside it had become part of the walls. Elijah moved through the hallway with a trash bag in one hand and a ring of keys in the other, pausing near the youth room to switch off a lamp. On the bulletin board beside the door were photographs of teenagers planting vegetables in the community garden, children holding backpacks from the school supply drive, and Jamal Turner standing awkwardly beside Elijah with a shy smile after his first youth meeting. Elijah looked at that picture for a moment longer than the others. Boys like Jamal were the reason he kept notes. They were the reason he answered late calls from mothers who had no one else to trust. They were the reason he could not pretend that what happened on the roadsides and in interview rooms was separate from what happened in the pews. He was about to turn off the hallway light when headlights swept across the stained glass windows. Slow. Deliberate. Too close to the front steps to be someone turning around by mistake. Elijah did not move quickly. He set the trash bag down, slid the keys into his pocket, and walked toward the sanctuary doors with the same steady pace he used on Sunday mornings. Through the narrow window, he saw Sheriff Cole Whitaker's cruiser parked crooked near the curb, engine running, headlights aimed at the church like accusation. A second later, the driver's door opened, and Whitaker stepped out with Deputy Grant Miller behind him. Neither man removed his hat when they entered. That was the first insult. Not the loudest one, not the ugliest one, but Elijah noticed it. Men who respected a place did not walk into it like they were searching a warehouse. The front door opened without a knock. Whitaker came in first, his boots pressing dust into the clean aisle runner, his eyes moving over the pews, the pulpit, the offering table, and finally the pastor. Miller stayed a few steps behind, chewing gum with his arms loose at his sides, wearing the bored expression of a man hoping boredom would be mistaken for authority. "Evening, Pastor," Whitaker said, though his tone carried no greeting. Elijah stood beside the first row of pews, hands visible, shoulders relaxed. "Sheriff. Deputy. Bible study ended half an hour ago. If you are looking for someone, I may be able to help." Whitaker smiled, looking up toward the wooden cross above the pulpit. "Always helpful. That is what people say about you." "I try to be." "That is the thing about trying," Whitaker said, walking farther down the aisle. "Sometimes people try too hard." Elijah did not answer immediately. He watched the sheriff's path, the way his eyes kept returning to the hallway that led to the church office, the way Miller's attention lingered on the donation box near the wall. "Is this an official visit?" Elijah asked. Whitaker stopped near the pulpit and turned slowly. "That depends on how cooperative you feel like being." The words were mild, but the threat underneath them was clear. Elijah had heard that kind of language in hospital rooms, courthouse halls, and front yards where families stood barefoot after midnight while patrol cars blocked their driveways. It was the language of men who wanted obedience before they gave a reason. "If there is a concern," Elijah said, "you are welcome to state it plainly." Miller let out a short laugh. "He talks like a lawyer." Whitaker glanced at him, then back at Elijah. "No, he talks like a man who has been spending too much time with one." Elijah understood the reference. Maya. His daughter had been asking questions around town, careful questions, legal questions, the kind that made powerful men nervous because they came with paperwork. He kept his face calm. "My daughter has a right to practice law. People have a right to ask for help. People have a right to a lot of things," Whitaker said, stepping closer. "But stirring folks up against law enforcement is not ministry. Telling the truth is not stirring people up." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was, the first small crack in his performance. He had expected fear, maybe defensiveness, maybe a pastor eager to smooth things over. Elijah gave him none of it. The calm bothered him more than anger would have. Whitaker walked to the end of the first pew and ran one finger along the polished wood, inspecting the dust that was not there. "You know what I see when I look at this place?" he asked. "I see a lot of money moving around without much oversight. Food drives. Youth programs. Donations. Cash envelopes. People coming and going after dark." Elijah's voice remained even. "Every dollar is recorded. Every program has receipts. The church books are reviewed by the board each quarter." "Church board," Miller muttered. "Convenient." Elijah looked at him for the first time. Not harshly. Not fearfully. Just directly enough that Miller shifted his jaw and looked away for half a second. That half second angered him. "You got something to say?" Miller asked. "No, Deputy," Elijah replied. "I am listening." Whitaker gave another smile, but this one had less patience in it. "See, Pastor, that is what worries me. You listen too much. To the wrong people. People with records. People with grudges. People who do not understand how hard this job is. Some of those people came here after your officers stopped them. Because they broke the law. Some were never charged." Whitaker's jaw tightened. The sanctuary seemed to grow still around them. Outside, the cruiser engine hummed against the night. Inside, the small red light above the hallway camera blinked quietly, catching the angle from the pulpit to the front doors. Elijah knew it was there. Whitaker did not. "You better be careful," the sheriff said, his voice lower now. "A man in your position can do a lot of good. Or he can confuse himself into thinking this collar makes him bigger than the town he lives in." Elijah's gaze did not drop. "This collar does not make me bigger than anyone. It reminds me to serve everyone. Including criminals." Miller snapped. Elijah turned his head slightly. "Especially people others have already decided are not worth saving." Miller took one step forward before Whitaker lifted a hand to stop him. The sheriff was still smiling, but his eyes had gone cold. "That sounds real noble from up there. But let me tell you what I know. Sometimes a church becomes a shield. Sometimes a pastor becomes a mouthpiece for people who need to stay quiet. And sometimes, when we look closely, we find things behind holy doors that do not belong there." Elijah heard the sentence for what it was. Not a concern. A preview. Still, he did not raise his voice. "If you intend to search this church, bring a warrant." The words landed harder than a shout. Miller stared at him, offended by the fact that he had said them at all. Whitaker tilted his head. "You refusing to cooperate? I am asking you to follow the law. Careful, Pastor." "I am being careful." For the first time, Whitaker stepped close enough that Elijah could smell coffee on his breath and rainwater on his jacket. The sheriff looked him up and down, lingering on the Bible in Elijah's hand, then on the old wedding ring, then back to his face. "Men like you always think politeness will protect you," he said softly. "You wrap defiance in manners and expect everybody to clap for your courage." Elijah's expression did not change. "I am not looking for applause." "Then what are you looking for?" "Accountability." The word seemed to strike something deep in Whitaker, something old and prideful. His smile disappeared completely. For a moment, the badge on his chest caught the hallway light and flashed like a warning. Miller watched, eager for permission to do more, to say more, to turn the quiet into something useful. But Whitaker was too controlled for that. He knew better than to cross certain lines without preparation. Not yet. Not with cameras he had not checked. Not with a pastor who would not give him an excuse. So he stepped back, adjusted his hat, and let the smile return like a mask being put back into place. "Enjoy your service Sunday," he said. Big day, I hear. Baptism and all. Elijah's eyes sharpened just slightly, but his voice stayed calm. Everyone is welcome in the Lord's house, Sheriff. Whitaker turned toward the doors. That is generous. Maybe too generous. Miller followed him, but before stepping outside, he looked back at the donation box and then at Elijah with a smirk that was almost a promise. The doors closed behind them, leaving the sanctuary in a silence that felt different from peace. Elijah stood still until the cruiser pulled away from the curb, its headlights sliding across the windows one last time before disappearing down the street. Only then did he walk to the hallway, look up at the camera, and confirm the red light was still blinking. Recording. He went into his office, unlocked the lower drawer, and removed the folder of complaints. For a moment, he rested his hand on it, not afraid, not surprised, only saddened by how predictable proud men could be when truth came too close. Then his phone buzzed on the desk. A secure message from DB appeared on the screen. They visited you tonight. Elijah looked toward the empty sanctuary, then typed back slowly, yes. The reply came less than a minute later. Do not meet them alone again. Preserve the footage. Elijah closed his eyes, breathed once, and whispered, Lord, give us the wisdom to do this right. But even as he prayed, he understood what had changed. Whitaker had come to measure him and found a man who would not bend. And because Elijah Brooks had not lowered his eyes, the sheriff had already decided that Sunday would not be a warning. It would be a spectacle. Sunday arrived with a clean blue sky over Ashford, the kind of morning that made the church windows glow before anyone touched a light switch, and for a little. While New Hope Baptist felt exactly like what Pastor Elijah Brooks had prayed it would be, a shelter. By 9:45, the sanctuary was nearly full. Families filled the pews in their Sunday clothes, ushers moved quietly along the aisle, the choir hummed through its final warm-up, and near the front, Jamal Turner stood beside his mother with his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. Elijah saw the nervousness in the boy's face and gave him a small nod from the pulpit. It was not a show. It was not a performance. It was a promise that the boy was not alone. Sister Ruth moved along the side aisle, checking on the elderly members, collecting extra programs, and glancing once toward the small camera above the hallway door. The red light blinked steadily. She had checked the backup recorder twice that morning because Elijah had asked her to, and because she had learned long ago that faith did not mean leaving truth unprotected. The service began with a hymn that filled the old wooden room from floor to ceiling. People clapped softly. Children leaned against their mothers. A few men in the back wiped their eyes when Jamal stepped into the baptism water, his white shirt darkening at the sleeves as Elijah placed one hand behind his shoulders and spoke gently about second chances. For one sacred minute, the whole church seemed to breathe together. Then the front doors opened hard enough to strike the wall. The hymn broke apart. Heads turned. Sheriff Cole Whitaker stood in the doorway with Deputy Grant Miller beside him and several officers behind them, their uniforms dark against the morning light. The timing was deliberate. He had not come before service, when the church was quiet. He had not come after, when people could leave with dignity. He came at the moment most likely to shame, frighten, and control. The water in the baptism pool rippled around Jamal's legs as the boy froze. His mother whispered his name. Pastor Elijah did not move except to place himself slightly in front of the boy. Sheriff, he said, his voice steady enough to carry across every pew. You are interrupting a baptism. Whitaker took off his sunglasses slowly, letting the room wait. On him. No, Pastor. I am interrupting a crime. The word struck the congregation like a cold draft. A murmur rose immediately, but Whitaker raised one hand and let his officers spread out near the walls. Everybody stay seated. Keep your hands where my deputies can see them. Mrs. Alvarez, sitting near the aisle with her granddaughter, drew the child into her lap. Mr. Coulson leaned on his cane but did not stand. A young man in the third row reached for his phone, and Miller pointed at him sharply. Put it down. "This is a house of worship," Elijah said. "These people are not suspects." Whitaker smiled like he had been hoping for that sentence. That is exactly the kind of thing a man says when he has been hiding behind good people for too long. The first insult was aimed at Elijah, but it landed on everyone. Whitaker walked down the center aisle, slow and confident, letting his gaze sweep over the congregation as if they were evidence already collected. "We have credible information that this church has been used to move illegal funds through a so-called charity program. We also have reason to believe narcotics and an unregistered firearm are being stored somewhere on the property." Gasps broke out across the room. Jamal's mother stood halfway, her voice trembling. "That is a lie." Miller turned toward her. "Sit down." Elijah lifted his hand gently toward her, not to silence the truth, but to protect her from men who were waiting for any excuse to turn fear into force. "Sister Denise," he said, "please stay with your son." Whitaker noticed the control Elijah still had over the room, and it irritated him. He had expected panic. He had expected shouting. He had expected the pastor to look guilty simply because a badge accused him. Instead, Elijah stood wet-robed and barefoot at the edge of the baptism pool, calm as stone, giving comfort to the very people Whitaker wanted frightened. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You always know how to perform for them, do you not?" he said. The gentle pastor. The community hero. The man with a Bible in one hand and other people's dirty money in the other. A few people cried out in protest. Elijah's expression did not change. "If you have a warrant, present it." Whitaker stepped closer to the pulpit and pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. He held it up without handing it over. "Careful. You are not in charge here." "The law is," Elijah replied. That answer moved through the room like a spark. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough that Whitaker felt it. Miller felt it too. He moved toward the hallway leading to the pastor's office, but Sister Ruth stepped into the aisle before she seemed to realize she had done it. She was a small woman, older, with a church program in one hand and keys in the other, but her eyes were sharp. "That office holds private records," she said. "Donations. Counseling notes. Family assistance files." Miller looked her up and down with open contempt. "Move, Grandma." Elijah's voice came firm, but still controlled. "Deputy Miller, you will address her with respect." Miller turned back, offended that a man in cuffs he had not yet placed would correct him in front of everyone. Or what? The room fell quiet. Whitaker's smile returned, thin and ugly. "See, Pastor, that is your problem. You keep acting like this place gives you authority. But today, people are going to see what you really are." He nodded to Miller. "Search the office." Sister Ruth did not move at first. Elijah met her eyes from across the sanctuary and gave the smallest shake of his head. "Do not give them what they want." She stepped aside slowly, but as Miller passed, she looked toward the hallway camera. The red light blinked. He did not see it. He was too busy enjoying the way people watched him. He pushed open the office door and disappeared inside with another officer behind him. Whitaker remained in the sanctuary, turning the weight into part of the punishment. He walked near the pews and pointed at the offering basket stacked by the side table. "How much cash moves through here on a Sunday?" he asked. Elijah stepped out of the baptism pool, water dripping from the hem of his robe onto the floor. "Every donation is counted by 2 board members and recorded." "That is not what I asked." "It is the truthful answer." Whitaker leaned toward the congregation. "You hear that? He is polished. Men like this always are. Give them a pulpit and they learn how to make anything sound holy." Jamal's mother held her son now, wrapping a towel around his shoulders while he stared at Elijah with wide, frightened eyes. The boy had come to wash away shame, and Whitaker was trying to hand him a new kind in front of everyone. Elijah saw it. The anger moved through him quietly, controlled by something stronger than pride. Sheriff, he said, if your concern is with me, leave the children out of it. Whitaker turned on him. Children? Is that what you call them when they are useful to you? Half the boys in your program have records. Some have mistakes behind them. That is why we help them build something ahead of them. You help them hide. No, Elijah said. I help them stand. The calm answer seemed to cut Whitaker deeper than any insult could have. He wanted Elijah defensive. He wanted him flustered. He wanted the congregation to see a man unraveling. Instead, Elijah made him look smaller by refusing to lower himself. Whitaker moved close enough that the front row could hear every word. You really believe you are untouchable, do you not? No man is untouchable. Good. Whitaker's voice dropped. Remember you said that. From the hallway came the sound of drawers opening, then something being knocked to the floor. Sister Ruth flinched, but did not speak. Maya Brooks, sitting near the side aisle in a navy dress, rose from her seat. Sheriff, I am an attorney, and I am requesting that you instruct your deputy not to disturb privileged church records beyond the scope of the warrant. Whitaker looked at her with a slow, patronizing smile. Miss Brooks. I wondered when you would stand up. I am asking you to follow the warrant. No, he said. You are trying to interfere with an active investigation. I am making a legal objection. Miller's voice came from the office before Whitaker could answer. Sheriff. You need to see this. The timing was too clean. Too rehearsed. Elijah heard it and knew at once. Sister Ruth knew too. Her fingers tightened around the church program until the paper bent. Whitaker turned with theatrical patience, then walked toward the hallway. The congregation strained to see. Phones began rising again, quietly this time, hidden low between hymnals and purses. One young woman angled her screen toward the hallway without lifting her hand above the pew. Mr. Coulson tapped the record button with a thumb that shook from age but not from fear. Every word they said was being recorded. Every step they took was becoming part of a story Whitaker thought he controlled. A moment later, Miller emerged carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside were stacks of cash, a small packet of white powder, and an old pistol wrapped partly in a cloth. The sight of it made the room erupt. People stood. Someone cried, "No!" Jamal backed into his mother's arms. Maya's face hardened, but she did not move forward. Sister Ruth whispered, "Lord have mercy," not because she believed the evidence, but because she understood the depth of the lie. Whitaker took the bag from Miller and held it high enough for the congregation to see. "Well," he said, almost softly. "What do we have here?" Elijah stood at the edge of the pulpit, his wet robe now clinging to the sleeves of his suit. He looked at the bag, then at Miller's face. The deputy was smiling too much. A man who had found something terrible in a church would have looked solemn. Miller looked proud. "That was not in my office," Elijah said. "Of course not," Whitaker replied. "Nothing ever belongs to men like you when it is finally found." The sentence carried an ugliness that did not need a louder voice. The congregation heard it. Maya heard it. Hales, standing near the back wall, heard it too. Deputy Ryan Hales had come in with the others, quiet, tense, positioned by the doors. Until that moment, he had told himself the sheriff must have had real information. Now he saw the little glance between Whitaker and Miller, the satisfaction instead of surprise, and something in his stomach turned. He looked toward the hallway, then at the camera above it. For the first time all morning, he realized the church might have seen more than the sheriff intended. Whitaker opened the evidence bag just enough to look inside, then closed it again with careful drama. "Pastor Elijah Brooks," he said, raising his voice, "you have used this congregation, this charity, and this building as a cover for criminal activity." Maya stepped into the aisle. "Do not answer that, Pastor." Whitaker pointed at her. "Sit down before I decide you are part of this." Elijah turned toward his daughter, his eyes gentle but firm. Maya. Let him finish making his record. The words were quiet, but they landed in the room with strange force. Whitaker noticed. My record? Yes, Sheriff. Elijah's hands rested at his sides. The one you are creating right now. For a second, Whitaker's expression shifted. Not fear. Not yet. But annoyance sharpened by uncertainty. He looked around and saw phones lower too quickly, eyes watching too carefully, people who should have been trembling beginning to understand they were witnesses. That only made him push harder. Cuff him, he ordered. Miller moved eagerly. Maya started forward, but Elijah lifted his hand again. Do not. Dad, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. He gave her the look he had given grieving families, frightened boys, angry mothers, and anyone else standing on the edge of doing something that would cost them. Not this way. Miller stepped behind him and took his wrists. He pulled them back harder than necessary, not enough to injure, but enough to humiliate. The metal cuffs clicked shut in the middle of the sanctuary. The sound was small, but it changed the air. A child began crying in the back row. Sister Ruth pressed one hand to her chest. Jamal whispered, Pastor, like a boy watching the only steady thing in his life being taken away. Whitaker walked close, lowering his voice so the first pews and several phones could still catch it. Look at them, he said. All these people believed you. I almost feel sorry for them. Elijah turned his head slightly. You should feel sorry for yourself. Miller jerked his arm. Watch your mouth. Elijah did not resist. He did not stumble into anger. He simply looked at Whitaker with a sadness that made the sheriff's face redden. You brought a lie into a holy place, Elijah said. That is a heavy thing to carry. Whitaker laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, Pastor. You are the one about to be carried out of here in cuffs. He faced the congregation again. Let this be a lesson. No one in Ashford is above the law. Including you, Maya said. Her voice was steady, but full of fire. Whitaker looked back at her. You keep talking, counselor, and I will have your office searched next. That threat was a mistake. People heard it. Phones caught it. Hales looked down at the floor. Miller looked pleased. Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in restraint. When he opened them, he spoke to the congregation, not the sheriff. No one raise a hand. No one shout at these officers. Protect the children. Protect the truth. Whitaker's patience snapped in a quieter, more dangerous way. Move him. Miller guided Elijah down the steps from the pulpit. He did it with unnecessary pressure, making sure every row saw the pastor in cuffs. As they passed the baptism pool, water still reflecting the stained glass light, Jamal reached out as if to touch Elijah's sleeve. His mother held him back gently. Elijah stopped just long enough to meet the boy's eyes. This does not change what God started in you, he said. Do you hear me? Miller pushed him forward. Keep walking. The congregation reacted, anger rising now, but Elijah's voice cut through it before it became what Whitaker wanted. Peace. One word. Firm enough to hold them. Whitaker hated that most of all. Even in cuffs, even falsely accused, even humiliated in front of his church, Elijah still had more authority in that room than the man with the badge. So Whitaker reached for the last weapon men like him used when their power felt challenged. He attacked the pastor's name. You people always fall for a good act, he said to the congregation. A soft voice, a Bible verse, a charity box. Meanwhile, he is dragging this neighborhood deeper into the dirt and calling it ministry. A heavy silence followed. Not because people believed him, but because the cruelty was too naked to hide. Elijah stopped walking. Miller tightened his grip, but Elijah did not turn toward him. He turned toward Whitaker. "Say what you want about me," he said quietly. "But do not insult the people you are sworn to protect." Whitaker stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "I decide who needs protecting. That is what frightens them." The sheriff's face hardened completely. For a moment, he looked like he might say something even worse, something that had lived inside him for years and finally wanted air. Instead, he pointed toward the doors. "Get him out." They led Elijah down the aisle between the pews. People reached toward him but did not touch. Some cried. Some recorded. Some simply watched with the stunned focus of people who knew they were witnessing a line being crossed. As Elijah passed Sister Ruth, he leaned just slightly toward her and spoke so softly that only she heard. "The hallway." Her eyes flicked once toward the camera. Then she nodded. Whitaker saw the movement but did not understand it. Not yet. Outside, the morning sun was too bright. 2 patrol cars waited near the steps, their lights flashing red and blue across the church sign that read, "Grace welcomes all." The contrast was so sharp that several people paused at the doorway as if the world itself had become wrong. Miller placed Elijah near the rear door of the cruiser while Whitaker turned to face the gathering crowd spilling out behind them. He wanted the image. He wanted the town to see Pastor Brooks in cuffs. He wanted the photograph to travel faster than the truth. "Let this be clear," Whitaker announced. "This investigation is not over. Anyone connected to these activities should think carefully before interfering." His eyes moved to Maya, then to Sister Ruth, then to Jamal and his mother. It was not a warning. It was a threat dressed as procedure. Elijah stood beside the cruiser, wrists behind him, back straight. The lights moved across his face, red, then blue, then red again. He looked once toward the church, toward the people he had spent his life serving, toward the cameras in their hands and the truth hidden safely in corners Whitaker had not bothered to check. Then he looked at the sheriff. "You still have time to stop lying," he said. Whitaker stepped close, speaking through a smile meant for the crowd. "Pastor, by tomorrow morning, no one will care what you say." Elijah's voice remained calm. "By tomorrow morning, Sheriff, you may wish that were true." Whitaker stared at him, irritated by the certainty in the words. Then he nodded to Miller, and the cruiser door opened. As Elijah was placed inside, the congregation stood on the church steps in a silence that no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like memory forming. Sister Ruth slipped away through the side entrance before anyone noticed, moving faster than her age suggested, keys in hand, eyes fixed on the office hallway. Maya watched the cruiser pull away, then looked down at her phone as a message appeared from a secure number she did not recognize. It contained only 4 words, "Preserve everything. Now." Across town, Sheriff Whitaker believed he had just won the morning. He had the image, the accusation, the staged evidence, and the pastor in custody. What he did not have was control of the truth. He did not have the camera footage from the hallway. He did not have the phones that had recorded his threats. He did not have Deputy Hales's growing doubt. And he did not know that every cruel word he had spoken inside that church had just added another count to the case being built beyond his reach. The cruiser carried Pastor Elijah Brooks away from New Hope Baptist Church with its lights flashing, but no siren, as if Sheriff Whitaker wanted the whole town to see the shame without hearing the emergency. Elijah sat in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him, shoulders pressed against the hard plastic partition, his wet robe folded awkwardly over his knees. Through the window, Ashford moved past in familiar pieces, the barber shop where he had prayed with Mr. Jenkins after his stroke, the corner store where he bought peppermints for the children after choir practice, the cracked sidewalk outside the laundromat where he had first found Jamal Turner pretending not to be hungry. People stopped and looked as the cruiser passed. Some recognized him immediately. Some lifted phones. Some simply stared with the stunned expression of people watching something wrong become official because a badge was attached to it. Deputy Grant. Miller sat in the front passenger seat, glancing back every few seconds with the satisfied little smile of a man hoping fear would finally show. "Quiet back there, Pastor," Miller said. "No sermon for us?" Elijah looked out at the street and answered without raising his voice. "Not every man is ready to hear one." Miller's smile faded. "You still think you are better than everybody?" Elijah turned his head slightly. "No. I think every person answers for what he does when he believes no one can stop him." The driver, Deputy Hales, said nothing. His hands tightened on the wheel. He had heard enough that morning to know the arrest was not clean, but he had not yet found the courage to name it. The evidence bag sat on the console between him and Miller, too neatly prepared, too quickly discovered, too convenient for a case that had supposedly begun with a tip. Hales kept seeing the hallway camera in his mind. That tiny red light. That blinking witness. Elijah noticed Hales watching the road instead of joining Miller's mockery. He noticed the tension in the young deputy's jaw, the way his eyes flicked once toward the rearview mirror and then away. Elijah had spent decades reading men who were one decision away from either saving themselves or losing themselves. Hales was such a man. So Elijah did not accuse him. He did not plead with him. He simply sat in quiet control, because his calm was not weakness. It was strategy rooted in faith, patience, and a promise he had made years earlier to never let rage make decisions truth could make better. At the sheriff's office, Miller opened the rear door and pulled Elijah out with unnecessary force, enough to make people watching from the sidewalk gasp, but not enough to leave a mark that would complicate a report. Whitaker knew that kind of theater well. Humiliation without evidence. Pressure without proof. Damage that lived in memory instead of photographs. Elijah steadied himself, stood upright, and walked inside without bowing his head. The lobby went silent. A dispatcher stopped typing. A young officer near the coffee machine looked down at his shoes. On the wall beside the front desk was Sheriff Whitaker's portrait, smiling beneath a polished frame. Elijah looked at it only once. Men who built kingdoms on fear always made sure their picture hung where frightened people had to see it. They placed him in a small holding room first, not a cell, because Whitaker still wanted the option of calling this cooperation if anyone important asked. The room had a metal table, 2 chairs, a camera in the upper corner, and a clock that ticked louder than it needed to. Miller removed the cuffs from Elijah's wrists only after making him wait. Red lines showed where the metal had pressed against his skin. Elijah rubbed one wrist slowly, then folded his hands on the table as if he were sitting across from a grieving widow instead of waiting for the next lie. Miller stood by the door. "You know, this would go easier if you stopped acting innocent." Elijah looked at him. "Innocence is not an act." Miller scoffed and left him alone. For several minutes, Elijah sat in the humming silence of the room, and only then did the weight of the morning move through him. Not fear. Not even surprise. Grief. He thought of Jamal standing in the baptism pool, eyes wide, a sacred moment turned into a public wound. He thought of Sister Ruth's face when the bag appeared. He thought of Maya trying to step forward, the fire in her eyes barely held back by love and law. Then he thought of Daniel. His son had been a quiet child, the kind who took apart broken radios just to understand how sound traveled through wires. After his mother died, Daniel had become even quieter, but not colder. More focused. He had gone to Morehouse College on scholarship, then into federal service, telling the church only that he worked in investigations. Elijah never told people the full truth because Daniel's work required silence, and because a father's pride did not matter more than a son's safety. But Elijah knew enough. He knew Daniel had spent years following money through shell companies, turning whispers into warrants, and building cases against men who believed distance and local power would protect them. He knew Daniel did not move fast unless the evidence was ready. He knew the message that morning, preserve everything, was not the advice of a worried son alone. It was the language of a case already alive. Elijah closed his eyes and remembered a conversation from 6 weeks earlier, late on a rainy Thursday night, when Daniel had come to the church through the side entrance wearing a plain dark coat and carrying no briefcase. They had sat in Elijah's office while thunder rolled over the roof and Sister Ruth's new backup recorder blinked above the hallway. Daniel had looked older than 34 that night. Not tired exactly, but sharpened by responsibility. "Dad," he had said, placing a slim drive on the desk, "I need you to understand something. If Whitaker threatens you, you tell me. If he touches the church records, you preserve the footage. If he tries to bait you, you do not take it." Elijah had studied his son's face. "You are already investigating him." Daniel had not answered right away. He had looked at the old photograph of his mother on the shelf, then back at Elijah. "I cannot discuss an active federal matter." Elijah had almost smiled. "You sound like a government handbook." "I sound like a son trying to keep his father alive and his case clean." That had ended the smile. Daniel leaned forward then, voice lower. "He has friends in the county. Maybe at the courthouse. Maybe in the property room. Maybe beyond that. If he moves against you, it means he is scared. But we cannot win this on emotion." Elijah had tapped the Bible on his desk. "I have been preaching restraint longer than you have been carrying a badge." Daniel's eyes softened for the first time that night. "Then preach it to yourself if he comes." Now, sitting beneath the sheriff's camera, Elijah understood why his son had looked so serious. Whitaker had not stumbled into sin that morning. He had followed a pattern Daniel was already tracing. The planted evidence, the public arrest, the threat to Maya, the warning to the congregation, all of it belonged to a larger shape. And if Daniel was watching that shape from Atlanta, then the sheriff had just stepped into water deeper than he knew. Elijah opened his eyes when the door clicked. Sheriff Whitaker entered alone this time, carrying a file and wearing the pleased expression of a man arriving to collect surrender. He placed the file on the table but did not sit. "You embarrassed a lot of people today," he said. Elijah looked at the folder. "I did not bring officers into a baptism." Whitaker's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed smooth. "You are still trying to sound righteous. I admire the commitment. I am trying to tell the truth." "Truth?" Whitaker leaned both hands on the table. "Truth is what I can prove. Right now, I can prove we found cash, narcotics, and a weapon in your office. You can prove your deputy carried them out." Whitaker paused. It was small, almost invisible, but Elijah saw it. The sheriff had expected denial, anger, panic. He had not expected precision. "Careful," Whitaker said. "Accusing law enforcement is serious. So is lying under oath." The room cooled. Whitaker studied him, and for the first time that day, Elijah saw something behind the arrogance. Not fear, but the beginning of calculation. The sheriff was wondering how much Elijah knew. He was wondering whether the pastor's calm came from faith alone or from something hidden behind it. Elijah gave him nothing more. That was the discipline Daniel had asked for. That was the discipline his wife had loved in him when he was a younger man learning that righteous anger still needed a righteous path. Whitaker straightened. "You have a daughter with a law license and a congregation full of people willing to cry for you. That might help you in public. It will not help you in here." Elijah folded his hands again. "I am not alone in here." Whitaker laughed softly. "God going to testify for you?" Elijah looked up at the camera in the corner, then back at the sheriff. "No. But men often forget how many witnesses they create when they believe they are powerful." Whitaker's smile disappeared. For 1 second, only one, the room belonged to Elijah. Not because he had a badge. Not because he had raised his voice. Because he knew something the sheriff did not, and he was patient enough not to reveal it before its time. Outside the room, Deputy Hales stood near the hallway copier, pretending not to listen while every word passed through the thin door. In his pocket, his personal phone felt heavier than it had that morning. On it was a number he had written down months earlier from an anonymous federal inquiry, a number he had told himself he would never call unless things got worse. Inside the room, Whitaker gathered his file and pointed once toward Elijah. "By tonight, your name will be on every local station from here to Macon." Elijah nodded slowly. "Then by morning, the truth will have farther to travel." Whitaker stepped back, unsettled despite himself, and left the room with more force than necessary. Elijah remained seated beneath the humming light, wrists marked, robe drying unevenly, reputation under attack across town. To anyone watching through the glass, he looked like a pastor with no power left. But his silence was not surrender. It was a locked door. Behind it were cameras, witnesses, records, a daughter who knew the law, a deputy whose conscience was waking up, and a son in a federal room where every lie Sheriff Whitaker told was becoming easier to prove. Sister Ruth did not run when the patrol cars pulled away with Pastor Elijah Brooks. She moved with the careful speed of a woman who knew panic wasted time. While the congregation remained on the front steps, stunned beneath the flashing lights and the bright Sunday sun, Ruth slipped back through the side entrance and locked the door behind her. The sanctuary still carried the smell of baptism water, floor wax, and fear. A program lay crushed near the aisle. One hymnal had fallen open beneath the pew where Mrs. Alvarez had been sitting. The baptism pool was still, reflecting the stained glass window above it as if nothing had happened. Ruth stood there for one breath, one hand pressed against her chest, then forced herself into motion. Pastor Elijah's words echoed in her mind. "Protect the children. Protect the truth." She went straight to the hallway outside the pastor's office and looked up. The camera light was still blinking red. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, then unlocked the small utility closet beside the choir room. Behind a stack of paper towels and old Christmas decorations sat the backup recorder she had insisted on buying after the donation room break-in. Elijah had teased her at first, saying she had turned the church into a bank vault. Ruth had told him that thieves loved unlocked doors, and liars loved missing footage. Now her hands trembled as she pulled the recorder down, but her mind stayed sharp. She removed the memory card, placed it inside a white envelope, and wrote only one word across the front, "hallway." Then she removed the second card from the office camera system and wrote, "office." She did not watch them. She did not need to. She had seen Deputy Miller enter that hallway empty-handed and return with a miracle of evidence too perfect to be real. Outside, Maya Brooks was standing near the church steps, speaking quietly with 3 members of the congregation who had recorded the arrest on their phones. Her face looked calm from a distance, but Ruth knew that kind of calm. It was the calm of a daughter holding herself together because breaking down would help the wrong people. When Ruth opened the side door and called her name, Maya turned immediately. Ruth did not explain in the doorway. She simply held up the envelopes. Maya crossed the parking lot fast, her heels clicking over the pavement. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked. Ruth nodded. "Both angles. Hallway and office. I pulled them before anyone could come back with a new excuse." Maya took the envelopes with both hands, and for a moment the attorney disappeared. She was just Elijah's daughter, staring at the thin paper that might keep her father from being buried under a lie. Then the attorney returned. "Did anyone else touch the recorder?" "No." "Did the system timestamp automatically?" "Yes. Your father made sure after Daniel told him to upgrade it." Maya looked up at the name, but Ruth gave her no more. There were things she knew, things she guessed, and things she had promised not to say unless the time came. Instead, she pointed toward the congregation. "Several people recorded Whitaker threatening you." Maya turned to the crowd. "I need everyone who filmed anything to not post it yet. Do not edit it. Do not send it to friends. Send the original file to me, with the time and where you were standing. If you already uploaded it, tell me exactly where." Some nodded immediately. Others looked frightened. A man near the steps said, "What if they come after us too?" Maya's voice softened, but did not weaken. That is why we preserve the originals. That is why we do this together. Across the parking lot, Deputy Hales had remained behind longer than the others under the excuse of gathering witness names. He stood near his cruiser with a small notebook in hand, watching the church members move around Maya instead of scattering. Something about it unsettled him. Fear was supposed to isolate people. Whitaker counted on that. But this was doing something else. It was turning them into witnesses. Hales had seen Miller enter the office before the discovery. He had seen the bag in Miller's hand after. He had seen the exact moment when Whitaker looked less surprised than satisfied. Now he looked toward the hallway camera visible through the open church door and felt the shape of his own future tightening around him. If he said nothing, he belonged to the lie. If he spoke, Whitaker would destroy him if the federal people failed. He opened his notebook and pretended to write, but what he actually wrote was the time Miller entered the hallway, the time he came out, and the fact that no one had shown the warrant to the church board before the search began. His handwriting was small and tense. It was not courage yet, but it was a record. 27 miles away, in a federal building outside Atlanta, Special Agent Daniel Brooks stood in a conference room where blinds covered the windows and phones sat face down on the table. The wall ahead of him was covered with photographs, bank diagrams, county contracts, property room logs, and a map of Ashford marked with colored pins. Sheriff Cole Whitaker's picture sat near the center. Deputy Grant Miller's was connected to the evidence storage unit by 3 red lines. Daniel had not slept much in 2 days, but no one in the room would have known it from his face. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, a dark tie loosened at the collar, and the stillness of a man trained to separate pain from procedure until the work was done. On the main screen, a frozen image showed his father standing in the church aisle with cuffs on his wrists. Daniel looked at it only once before turning away. If he looked too long, he would become a son before he could finish being an agent. Beside him, Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Sloan reviewed the incoming messages from Maya. She says they have 2 internal camera angles, multiple phone recordings, and at least 1 deputy who may be unstable. Daniel looked up. Unstable how? Not violent. Nervous. She says he stayed behind, took notes, avoided Whitaker's eye line. Daniel nodded slowly. Ryan Hales. Another agent at the table, Marcus Reed, slid a folder forward. He is the one who answered our property room inquiry last month. Never called back, but he asked questions. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were copies of old evidence logs showing items marked for disposal that later appeared in unrelated case files. Cash amounts rounded down. Firearms moved without complete signatures. Narcotics weights that changed between intake and court submission. It was not enough by itself. It had never been enough by itself. That was the problem with corruption built by careful men. It rarely arrived as one obvious crime. It arrived as small missing pieces, each one explainable until someone showed the pattern. Whitaker had just given them the pattern in public. Daniel turned to the evidence board. We need the original files from the church, chain of custody documented. We need phone videos preserved with metadata. We need the warrant Whitaker claims he used. We need every radio transmission from this morning before they overwrite anything. Rebecca looked at him. And your father? Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. My father is a material witness and a victim of an alleged civil rights violation connected to an active corruption investigation. We protect the case by protecting the evidence first. The room was quiet for half a second. Everyone understood what that sentence cost him. Then Marcus spoke. I will send the preservation letters now. In Ashford, Maya drove from the church to her small law office with Sister Ruth in the passenger seat and the camera cards sealed inside a folder between them. They did not take the main road. Maya knew enough not to assume they were not being watched. At the office, she scanned the envelopes, photographed the labels, placed the cards in separate evidence sleeves, and recorded herself placing them into a small fireproof safe. Ruth watched, arms folded. "You learned that from Daniel?" Maya did not look up. "Some of it. He knows. He knew before I did." Ruth exhaled slowly. "Then God help Sheriff Whitaker." Maya's phone buzzed with an encrypted call. She answered, and Daniel's voice came through calm, controlled, and distant in the way he sounded when he was holding too much back. "Maya, do not bring the original cards to the sheriff's office. Do not let local officers touch them. Upload copies to the secure link I am sending now, and keep the originals locked until a federal evidence team arrives." Maya closed her eyes for 1 second at the sound of her brother's voice. "Daniel, they took Dad." "I know. They put him in cuffs in front of the whole church." His silence lasted just long enough to reveal the sun beneath the agent. Then he said, "That is why we do this clean." Maya opened her eyes. "Tell me what you need." "Everything unedited. Every angle. Every person who recorded. Names of anyone who heard Whitaker threaten you. And Maya, listen carefully. If they call you to come down to the station, you decline unless federal counsel is present. If they come to your office, you do not open the door without a warrant. You think they will. I think Whitaker is scared, and scared men with badges create paperwork to justify what they already decided to do. At the sheriff's office, Whitaker was doing exactly that. He stood over a desk while Miller typed the arrest narrative, shaping the morning into something clean enough for a judge and dirty enough for the news. "Write that Brooks became verbally confrontational," Whitaker said. "Write that the congregation grew agitated due to his statements." Miller typed. "What about the daughter?" "Put that she interfered with execution of a lawful search." Hales stood near the doorway, listening. Notebook in his pocket. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "the warrant inventory should list who first located the evidence." Miller stopped typing. Whitaker turned. "It will. I mean exactly. Time, location, which drawer, who was present." Miller glared at him. "You writing a training manual now?" Hales felt his throat tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "Just making sure the report is solid." Whitaker studied him for a long moment. "That is smart. Because if this report is not solid, everyone in this room has a problem." Hales nodded, but the words landed differently than Whitaker intended. Everyone in this room. By the time he stepped into the hallway, Hales knew what he had to do. He walked into the restroom, locked the door, turned on the sink, and took out his personal phone. The number from the federal inquiry was still saved under no name, only a string of digits. His thumb hovered over it. Then he typed a message instead of calling, "This is Deputy Ryan Hales, Ashford County. I was present at New Hope Baptist this morning. I believe evidence may have been planted. I have notes. I am afraid to report internally." He stared at the message until his reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Then he pressed send. In Atlanta, Daniel's phone vibrated on the table. He read the message once, then passed it to Rebecca Sloan. She looked at it and said, "There is your witness." Daniel turned toward the board where his father's church now connected to the sheriff's office, the property room, the county grant account, and a frightened deputy with a conscience. For the first time that day, the case no longer felt like pieces. It felt like a door beginning to open. Sheriff Whitaker still believed he was writing the story. He believed the report, the staged evidence, and the evening news would do what fear had always done for him. But the truth was moving faster now. It was in Maya's safe. It was in the metadata of a dozen phones. It was in Ruth's envelopes. It was in Hales's notebook. It was in the federal inbox where his first honest message had just arrived. And every lie Whitaker typed that afternoon would soon have to stand beside a camera angle he never knew existed. By late afternoon, Sheriff Cole Whitaker no longer looked like a man protecting a case. He looked like a man trying to outrun one. The first local news van had already parked across from the sheriff's office, drawn by the photograph of Pastor Elijah Brooks being led out of New Hope Baptist in cuffs. A county blogger had posted a blurry image with the headline, "Pastor Arrested After Drug Evidence Found Inside Church," and by 3 o'clock the story had traveled through Ashford faster than the truth could catch it. Whitaker loved that part. He stood in his office watching the comments roll across the screen on Miller's phone, each one doing a little more of his work for him. Some people defended Elijah. Some demanded patience. But others, the ones Whitaker had counted on, believed the accusation the moment they saw the cuffs. That was the cruel power of a public arrest. It did not need to prove guilt. It only needed to stain the name long enough for doubt to feel reasonable. "See," Miller said, leaning against the file cabinet. "By tonight, half the county will think he has been running dope out of the choir room." Whitaker did not smile. He was past enjoying it. Too many things had begun moving beyond his control. Maya Brooks had not come to the station when he asked. Sister Ruth had disappeared from the church for nearly an hour and returned with no explanation. Deputy Hales had gone quiet in the dangerous way quiet men did when they were thinking too much. And worst of all, the county clerk had called to say a federal preservation request had arrived for body camera footage, radio traffic, property room logs, and all records connected to the search at New Hope Baptist. Federal. The word sat in Whitaker's mind like a ticking clock. He told himself it was a scare tactic from Maya. He told himself no federal office moved that fast on a Sunday unless someone important had screamed loudly enough. Then he remembered Elijah's calm in the interrogation room, the way the pastor had looked toward the camera and spoken about witnesses. Whitaker had seen guilty men. He had seen innocent men. But he had rarely seen a man in cuffs who behaved as if time itself was working for him. That was what made him dangerous. "Bring Brooks back in," Whitaker said. Miller straightened. "For another interview? For a confession?" "He is not going to sign one." Whitaker turned from the window. "Then he is going to refuse on record after being offered a chance to protect his church. Either way, I get something useful." Miller nodded, but his confidence was thinner than it had been that morning. Down the hall, Pastor Elijah sat alone in the holding room, his robe exchanged for the dark suit he had worn underneath, the collar of his shirt still damp from the baptism water. His wrists ached where the cuffs had pressed, but he kept his hands folded on the table and his breathing slow. The clock above the door read 4:18. He had been given no phone call yet, no formal meeting with counsel, only questions shaped like accusations and silence shaped like pressure. He knew the old methods. Exhaust the person. Isolate the person. Make the lie sound easier than the truth. But Elijah had spent too many years listening to frightened people describe this room from the other side. He had sat with mothers after their sons came home shaking. He had stood with fathers who signed statements they did not fully understand because someone told them it would be worse if they did not. He had promised himself that if his turn ever came, he would not make their suffering smaller by pretending he did not know the pattern. The door opened, and Whitaker entered with Miller behind him. This time, Deputy Hales was ordered to stand inside the room too, near the wall, notebook in hand. Elijah noticed the young deputy's eyes. They did not carry Miller's pleasure or Whitaker's pride. They carried conflict. Whitaker placed a typed statement on the table and slid it toward Elijah with 2 fingers. "This is your way out." Elijah looked at the paper but did not touch it. "My way out of what?" "Out of making this harder on the people you claim to love." Whitaker sat across from him, while Miller stayed standing, close enough to loom. "You sign this, you admit the cash and narcotics were being held temporarily by a member of your outreach program without your full knowledge. You accept responsibility for failing to report it. In exchange, I tell the prosecutor you cooperated. Maybe the church stays open. Maybe your daughter does not get dragged into an obstruction charge. Maybe those boys in your youth program do not get looked at too closely. Elijah lifted his eyes slowly. You want me to lie so you can call it mercy? Miller scoffed. You want to play noble while your people burn with you? Whitaker raised one hand to silence him, but the threat had already entered the room. Elijah looked from Miller to Whitaker. Leave the children out of this. Then stop hiding behind them, Whitaker snapped, the smoothness cracking at last. You think I do not know how this works? You parade those boys around, make everyone feel sorry, then use them as cover when the money starts moving. Elijah leaned back slightly, not away from fear, but away from the poison of the words. You keep speaking about children like they are evidence. Some of them are close enough. They are children. They are future case files if people like you keep filling their heads with resentment. Hales looked down at his notebook, but his pen had stopped moving. Elijah saw it. Whitaker did not. The sheriff pushed the statement closer. Sign it. Elijah did not move. No, Miller's face tightened. You better think carefully. I have. Your church can lose its charity status, Whitaker said. Your daughter can spend the next year fighting subpoenas. Sister Ruth can find herself answering questions about missing donations. That boy from this morning, Jamal, he has enough trouble in his background for us to take a very serious look at him. For the first time, something changed in Elijah's face. Not fear. Not anger out of control. A grief so deep it seemed to quiet the room. You would threaten a child to protect a lie. Whitaker's answer came without hesitation. I would protect this town from whatever disease you are spreading. The word disease hung there, ugly and naked. Miller looked satisfied. Hales looked up sharply. The camera in the corner kept recording, or at least it looked like it did. Whitaker noticed Elijah glance toward it and smiled. Do not bother. Interview recording is paused while we discuss cooperation. Elijah turned back to him. Paused by whose order? Mine. Then you have created another problem for yourself. Whitaker laughed, but the laugh was too sharp. You still think somebody is coming to save you? Elijah said nothing. His silence was not fear. It was the last mercy he was offering a man determined to destroy himself. Whitaker stood abruptly and leaned over the table. Let me explain something to you. By 6 o'clock, I am holding a press conference. I will stand outside this building and tell every camera that we uncovered evidence of criminal activity inside your church. I will say your refusal to cooperate forced us to expand the investigation. I will say your daughter attempted to interfere. I will say members of your congregation may be involved. And because people already saw you in cuffs, most of them will believe just enough of it to stay quiet. Elijah looked at him with steady eyes. And what will you say when the hallway footage comes out? The room, at 4:58 the next morning, Ashford was still caught between night and dawn, the streets washed in a pale blue quiet that made every building look like it was holding its breath. Inside the sheriff's office, fluorescent lights buzzed over tired faces, half-empty coffee cups, and reports that had been rewritten so many times the lie was beginning to look nervous on the page. Sheriff Cole Whitaker stood in the conference room adjusting his tie for the press statement he still planned to give before sunrise. He had not slept. His eyes were red, his jaw tight, but his voice remained sharp as he ordered Miller to remove certain files from the property room and told the dispatcher to delay any outside records requests until he personally reviewed them. We control the timeline, Whitaker said, more to himself than anyone else. We control the story. Deputy Grant Miller nodded, but his usual smirk was gone. Deputy Ryan Hales sat at a desk outside the room, hands folded, badge still on his chest, radio silent beside him. He had not gone home either. He had sent his message to the federal number, then sent photographs of his notes, then sat under the weight of waiting. Every minute since had felt like standing on a railroad track listening for a train he could not yet see. In the holding room, Pastor Elijah Brooks stood near the narrow window with his suit jacket folded over one arm, his expression calm despite the long night. He had heard the building grow restless. Doors opening. Footsteps moving too fast. Voices lowered when they passed his room. Men who believed themselves powerful did not whisper unless power had started leaving them. Whitaker came to the holding room at 5:06, carrying a printed statement and a smile that tried to look victorious. Miller stood behind him, arms crossed. "Last chance, Pastor," Whitaker said, placing the statement against the glass instead of entering. "I am about to walk outside and tell this county exactly what kind of man you are. Once that happens, there is no taking it back." Elijah looked at him through the glass. "That is true." Whitaker frowned at the answer. "You should be more worried." "I am worried," Elijah said. "But not for myself." Miller rolled his eyes. "Still with the holy act." Elijah's gaze moved to him, gentle and steady. "No act lasts this long, deputy." Whitaker stepped closer to the window. "You keep waiting for help that is not coming." Before Elijah could answer, the lights in the hallway flickered once. Then the dispatcher's voice cracked over the intercom, strained and confused. "Sheriff, there are vehicles outside." Whitaker did not turn at first. "What vehicles?" No answer came immediately. Then Hales stood from his desk and looked toward the front doors. His face changed before anyone else understood why. A low rumble moved through the building, not loud, but heavy, several engines slowing at once. Outside, through the front windows, black sport utility vehicles rolled into the parking lot in a line so clean it looked rehearsed by silence itself. No sirens. No chaos. Just headlights cutting through the dawn and stopping one by one until every exit was covered. The sheriff's office froze. A young officer near the lobby lowered his coffee without drinking. Miller stepped away from the holding room door. Whitaker walked toward the front, every step slower than the last. "Who called state police?" he demanded. Hales did not answer. He was looking at the first vehicle. Its door opened. A man stepped out wearing a dark jacket over a tactical vest marked with 3 white letters that made the entire lobby go still. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then another agent stepped out. Then another. Quiet, disciplined, spreading with calm purpose across the lot. The front door opened, and the morning air came in cold. Special Agent Daniel Brooks entered first. He wore a navy suit beneath the open vest, his badge clipped at his belt, his face composed in a way that made the room feel smaller. Behind him came Agent Marcus Reed, Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Sloan, and a federal evidence team carrying sealed cases. Daniel did not rush. He did not shout. He simply walked to the center of the lobby, took out a folded warrant, and looked directly at Sheriff Whitaker. For a moment, Whitaker did not recognize him. He saw only the vest, the badge, the federal authority he had spent all night pretending was still far away. "This is a county law enforcement facility," Whitaker said, forcing volume into his voice. "You do not walk in here without notifying my office." Daniel held up the warrant. "Your office has been notified." Whitaker stared at him. "Who are you?" Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough for every deputy in the room to lean toward the answer. "Supervisory Special Agent Daniel Brooks. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Public Corruption and Civil Rights Division." The name landed first on Hales. Then on Miller. Then, slowly, on Whitaker. "Brooks." The sheriff's eyes flicked toward the holding room down the hall, then back to Daniel's face. He saw it then. Not fully at first. A resemblance in the eyes. The same controlled stillness. The same refusal to perform fear for men who demanded it. Miller's mouth opened slightly. "Brooks," he said under his breath. Daniel did not look at him. Whitaker tried to recover with a laugh that came out thin. "Well, that explains the dramatics. You are related to him." Daniel's expression did not change. Pastor Elijah Brooks is my father. That is disclosed in the warrant affidavit, along with my recusal from evidentiary review decisions involving his direct victim statement. Assistant United States Attorney Sloan is supervising that portion. This operation is authorized by a federal magistrate judge. Rebecca stepped forward with a second document. Sheriff Whitaker, this warrant authorizes the search of this facility, the property room, digital records, personnel communications, and any materials connected to the New Hope Baptist search, evidence handling, and witness intimidation. Whitaker's face hardened. This is retaliation. Daniel's voice stayed quiet. No. Retaliation is threatening to make a file fit a person. The lobby fell silent. Whitaker's lips parted, but no words came. Daniel turned slightly toward Marcus Reed. Play it. Marcus lifted a tablet. A recording filled the lobby, clear enough to make every deputy hear the sheriff's own voice from the church parking lot. If you keep interfering, I will treat you like every other person attached to that church. Then Maya's voice. Meaning what? Then Whitaker again, sharp and unmistakable. Meaning I know how to make a file fit a person. No one moved. The sound seemed to remain in the air even after Marcus stopped the recording. Miller looked at the floor. Hales closed his eyes for half a second. Whitaker's face lost color, then flushed with anger as he reached for control that was no longer there. That was taken out of context. Daniel nodded once to another agent. A second file opened. The hallway footage from New Hope Baptist appeared on the tablet screen, angled perfectly down the corridor to the pastor's office. It showed Miller entering empty-handed. It showed him looking back once. It showed him pulling a wrapped item from inside his jacket before disappearing into the office. It showed him returning moments later with the evidence bag that was supposed to have been discovered. This time, there was no sound in the lobby except the faint hum of the lights. Miller stepped back as if distance could separate him from the image. That is not what it looks like, he said, but his voice had no strength. Daniel finally looked at him. Deputy Miller, do not make a statement without counsel. The courtesy made the moment worse, because it reminded everyone that the federal agents had come with procedure, not rage. Whitaker had used the law like a costume. Daniel was using it like a blade, clean and exact. From the holding room window, Elijah watched his son stand in the lobby, not as the boy who once sat in the front pew swinging his legs, not as the grieving young man at his mother's funeral, but as the man he had become, disciplined, lawful, unshaken. Their eyes met across the hallway. Daniel's face softened for one brief second. Elijah gave the smallest nod, the kind a father gives when pride is too deep for words. Then Daniel turned back to the sheriff. Cole Whitaker, you are relieved of command authority over this facility for the duration of this federal operation. All deputies will step away from their desks and preserve their devices. Any deletion, alteration, or removal of records after this moment will be treated as obstruction of justice. Whitaker barked, nobody touches anything. But no one moved for him. That was the exact second the power changed hands. Not when the vehicles arrived. Not when the warrant was shown. When Whitaker gave an order and the room refused to obey it. Hales stepped forward, slowly removed his department-issued phone, and placed it on the front desk. I have notes, he said, voice shaky but clear. And I am willing to give a statement. Miller stared at him in disbelief. You coward. Daniel turned toward Miller. Deputy, step away from him. Miller looked at Whitaker for protection. Whitaker looked back with nothing to give. The badge on his chest, polished and bright beneath the lobby lights, suddenly seemed small. An evidence team moved past him toward the property room. Another agent sealed the dispatch computers. Rebecca Sloan began reading instructions to the deputies. Outside, the dawn finally broke over Ashford, pale gold touching the windows of the sheriff's office. Inside, the sheriff who had dragged a pastor from a church now stood surrounded by the very law he thought he could bend. Daniel walked down the hall and opened the holding room door. For the first time since the arrest, Pastor Elijah Brooks stepped out without a deputy's hand on him. Father and son stood facing each other in the narrow hallway, both holding back more emotion than either would show in front of the room. Daniel spoke first, his voice low. "Are you all right?" Elijah looked past him at Whitaker, then back at his son. "I am standing." Daniel nodded. "Then let us finish this the right way." And behind them, Sheriff Whitaker watched the man he had framed walk free while the son he had underestimated carried the warrant that would take his kingdom apart. The federal agents did not move like people who needed to prove they were in charge. They moved like people who already knew it. Within minutes of Daniel Brooks reading the warrant, the Ashford Sheriff's Office changed from Cole Whitaker's kingdom into a federal crime scene. Agents placed evidence seals over filing cabinets, photographed desks before anything was touched, collected department phones, and escorted deputies one by one into separate rooms for recorded interviews. The property room, the place Whitaker had treated like his private warehouse of useful lies, was locked down first. Marcus Reed stood at the door while a federal evidence technician cut the local padlock, photographed the broken seal that should not have been broken, and opened a ledger that told a story Whitaker had never expected anyone outside Ashford to read. Cash seized in one case had been logged in a lower amount 2 days later. Narcotics marked for destruction had no destruction certificate. An old pistol listed under a closed burglary file carried the same serial number as the weapon Miller claimed to have found in Pastor Elijah's office. Every page became another nail. Every missing signature became another witness. Whitaker stood near the front desk, trying to look offended instead of afraid, but the performance had lost its audience. The deputies who used to straighten when he spoke now kept their eyes on the federal agents. The dispatcher who once patched his calls without question sat with her hands folded while an agent copied the radio logs. The young officers who had laughed at Miller's joke said nothing at all. Power had not disappeared from the building. It had simply changed uniforms. Daniel stayed near the center of it, calm, exact, careful not to touch evidence tied directly to his father. He gave orders through Marcus and Rebecca when needed, keeping the case clean even when every human part of him wanted to walk straight to Whitaker and ask how a man could bring a lie into a church. Instead, he let the documents speak. He let the footage speak. He let the law do what Whitaker had spent years pretending it could not do to him. Deputy Grant Miller was the first one to break. When agents showed him the hallway footage from New Hope Baptist beside the property room log, his face drained of its arrogance. On the screen, he watched himself enter the office empty-handed, watched himself remove the planted items from inside his jacket, watched himself come back out pretending he had discovered what he had carried in. Then Marcus placed the property room ledger beside the video and pointed to Miller's signature on the training disposal list from the night before. "That is your name," Marcus said. Miller swallowed hard. "Sheriff told me it was authorized." Whitaker turned sharply. "Keep your mouth shut." Rebecca Sloan looked at Whitaker without raising her voice. "Sheriff, do not speak to a witness during a federal interview." The word witness hit Miller harder than deputy ever had. For the first time, he understood that Whitaker's protection had ended. No badge, no laugh, no hallway threat could save him from a camera angle he had not noticed. An hour later, after his attorney was contacted and his rights were read, Miller gave a preliminary statement. He admitted he had removed the cash, narcotics, and firearm from the property room. He admitted Whitaker had told him where to place them. He admitted the goal had been to discredit Pastor Brooks before the church records could reach federal investigators. He tried to make himself sound like a man following orders, but even that excuse could not wash the smile from the footage. By 7:12, Deputy Miller's badge, weapon, and identification card were placed into evidence bags, and he was escorted out through the side entrance to avoid the growing crowd outside. He did not leave as the man who had mocked a pastor. He left as a defendant in a federal corruption investigation, his wrists cuffed in front of the same deputies who once feared his temper. Ryan Hales gave his statement next. His voice shook at first, but the more he spoke, the steadier he became. He described the false report being shaped in the conference room. He described Whitaker instructing Miller to write that Pastor Brooks had agitated the congregation. He described the threat against Maya, the attempted seizure of church security equipment, and the moment Whitaker said he knew how to make a file fit a person. Hales handed over his notebook, the handwritten times from the church hallway, the note about Miller entering the office, and the message he had sent to the federal inquiry number. He did not claim courage he had not shown earlier. He said, plainly, that he had waited too long. Daniel listened from across the room, saying nothing until Hales finished. Then he said, "The truth is late. But it is still the truth." Hales nodded, eyes red, and signed the statement. Outside, the crowd had grown. Members of New Hope Baptist stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak. Maya Brooks arrived with Sister Ruth and two federal evidence technicians who had collected the original camera cards under proper chain of custody. Ruth walked into the sheriff's office wearing her church hat, white gloves, and the face of a woman who had outlived too many bullies to be impressed by one more. She placed the sealed envelopes on the evidence table and signed her name carefully on the receipt. "That man called my church a hiding place," she said to Marcus Reed. "Make sure the record shows who was hiding what." Marcus nodded. "It will." Maya went straight to her father. Pastor Elijah was seated in a small interview room now, no cuffs, no locked door, a cup of water on the table in front of him. When Maya stepped inside, she held herself together for about 3 seconds before crossing the room and taking his hands. She looked at the marks on his wrists and inhaled sharply. Elijah covered her hands with his. "I am here," he said. "That is enough for this moment." "No," Maya whispered. "It is not enough. But it is a start." Daniel entered a moment later. For the first time since dawn, the three Brooks family members stood in one room. They did not embrace immediately. Too much was still happening beyond the glass. Too many eyes. Too many duties. But something passed between them that no report could hold: relief, anger, pride, and the heavy knowledge that justice had arrived only after damage had already been done. Rebecca Sloan stepped in behind Daniel with a formal document. "Pastor Brooks," she said, "the federal government recognizes you as a victim and material witness in this investigation. The local charges filed against you this morning are being dismissed pending formal review, and we are notifying the county prosecutor that the evidence used in your arrest is compromised and appears to have been planted." Elijah closed his eyes for one breath. Not because he had doubted the truth, but because hearing a lie lose its official shape is its own kind of deliverance. "Thank you," he said. Rebecca continued, "Your church will also receive written notice that the federal search concerns law enforcement misconduct, not church wrongdoing. That will be public today." Maya's jaw tightened. "And Whitaker?" Rebecca looked through the glass toward the lobby, where the sheriff stood surrounded by the consequences of his own confidence. "We are getting there." They got there at 8:03. By then, the property room search had uncovered enough to remove every last shield Whitaker thought he still had. The pistol in the planted bag matched a closed case from 2 years earlier. The cash bands matched bank withdrawal records tied to a county contractor under federal review. The narcotics packet carried an old evidence label that had been peeled back but not fully removed. On Whitaker's office computer, agents found draft press statements prepared before the church search began, including one paragraph claiming Pastor Brooks had resisted questioning, written hours before the arrest ever happened. They found emails between Whitaker and a county official discussing how to neutralize Brooks before Atlanta gets involved. They found a deleted message to Miller from Saturday night: "Use the church office. Make it believable." Deleted did not mean gone. Not anymore. Daniel did not read the arrest advisement. He let Marcus do it, because the case had to stand cleaner than the anger inside it. Marcus approached Whitaker in the lobby while every remaining deputy watched. "Cole Whitaker, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, falsification of records, evidence tampering, and related federal offenses. Whitaker's face twisted with disbelief. You cannot arrest the sheriff in his own office. Rebecca stepped forward. We just did. The sentence emptied him. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for everyone to see the man behind the badge realize the badge could no longer translate his will into law. Marcus asked him to turn around. Whitaker looked across the lobby toward Pastor Elijah, who had stepped out of the interview room with Maya on one side and Daniel on the other. For a second, hate flashed across the sheriff's face, but it had nowhere to go. No crowd to command. No report to rewrite. No frightened person to corner. Elijah met his gaze without triumph. I prayed you would stop before this day came, he said. Whitaker said nothing. Marcus removed the sheriff's badge first. It came off with a small metallic click, far quieter than the cuffs Whitaker had placed on Elijah inside the church, but somehow heavier. Then the handcuffs closed around Whitaker's wrists. The deputies in the lobby watched their sheriff led past the front desk, past his framed photograph, past the flag, past the bulletin board covered with public safety awards that now looked like decorations on a lie. Outside, the crowd fell silent when he emerged. Phones rose, but no one cheered. They did not need to. The image was enough. The man who had staged shame at a church was now walking through the consequences in front of the town he had trained to fear him. Miller was placed in a separate federal vehicle. Whitaker in another. The vehicles pulled away without sirens, just as the cruiser had taken Elijah the day before, but this time the silence meant something different. It did not mean humiliation. It meant control had returned to the law. Before noon, the county announced Whitaker's immediate suspension pending removal proceedings. By 1 o'clock, the state attorney general's office confirmed an independent review of every case connected to Whitaker, Miller, and the Ashford property room for the past 8 years. By 3 o'clock, the county prosecutor moved to dismiss all local charges against Pastor Elijah Brooks. By sunset, New Hope Baptist received a formal federal letter clearing the church of wrongdoing and identifying it as the site of an alleged civil rights violation and evidence fabrication. The same local station that had shown Elijah in cuffs now played the hallway footage that proved the truth. Viewers saw Miller plant the evidence. They heard Whitaker threaten Maya. They heard him say he could make a file fit a person. And for the first time in years, people in Ashford who had whispered stories about false stops, missing cash, and planted charges began calling Maya's office openly. Pastor Elijah did not celebrate when his name was cleared. He returned first to the church, walking slowly up the front steps where the congregation was waiting. Jamal Turner stood near the door with his mother, still carrying the white towel from the baptism folded over one arm. When Elijah reached him, the boy looked ashamed, though he had done nothing wrong. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. We are going to finish what we started, he said. Jamal nodded, tears in his eyes, and for the first time since the doors had burst open, the boy smiled. Inside the sanctuary, the pulpit still stood where it had stood before the lie, the Bible still rested where Elijah had left it, and the baptism water had been covered to keep it clean. The church had been wounded, but not ruined. Elijah stood in the aisle, looking toward the hallway camera, toward Sister Ruth, toward Maya, toward Daniel, toward the people who had recorded, preserved, testified, and refused to let fear scatter them. Sheriff Whitaker had taken a badge and tried to turn a lie into law. But he had lost the badge, lost the office, lost the silence that protected him, and lost the power to decide whose truth mattered. Pastor Elijah Brooks got back his name. New Hope Baptist got back its dignity. And Ashford, for the first time in a long time, got proof that even a small town lie could fall when enough witnesses refused to look away. The days after Sheriff Whitaker's arrest did not feel like victory at first. They felt like a town waking up in a room it had kept dark for too long. Ashford still had the same roads, the same courthouse steps, the same diner off Highway 41, and the same brick sheriff's office with the flag outside, but something underneath had shifted. People who once lowered their voices when patrol cars passed now stood on sidewalks and looked directly at them. Mothers who had kept old traffic tickets, search receipts, and court papers in kitchen drawers brought them to Maya Brooks's office in grocery bags and worn envelopes. Men who had spent years telling themselves it was easier to forget sat across from her and spoke names, dates, badge numbers, and words they had never dared say in public. Maya opened a temporary civil rights clinic in the Fellowship Hall of New Hope Baptist because her office could not hold the line that formed by Tuesday morning. Sister Ruth set up folding chairs, made coffee, and placed a sign on the table that read, "Tell the truth. Start there." Pastor Elijah Brooks did not sit at the front like a man enjoying attention. He moved quietly from person to person, offering water, prayer, and steady encouragement. When one older man broke down while describing how cash from his son's car had vanished during a stop 3 years earlier, Elijah sat beside him until he could breathe again. When a young mother admitted she had been afraid to file a complaint because Whitaker had threatened her housing application, Elijah told her, "Fear kept you alive then. Truth can help you live now." The change did not stop at the church doors. By the end of the week, the state attorney general's office announced a full review of cases handled by Whitaker, Miller, and any deputy tied to the corrupted property room. A retired judge from outside the county was appointed to oversee the review. The county commission, under pressure from citizens who filled every seat and lined the walls, voted to create an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, public reporting requirements, and mandatory review of all use of force complaints. Body camera footage could no longer be deleted or marked corrupted by local supervisors alone. Evidence disposal now required 2 independent signatures and digital tracking that could be audited by the state. The property room was sealed, catalogued, and rebuilt under outside supervision. The first case reopened belonged to a 19-year-old named DeMarcus Hill, who had pleaded guilty after evidence appeared in his backpack during a stop he always said was false. His mother had kept every paper in a shoebox under her bed. When federal investigators compared his file with the same property room logs used to frame Elijah, the pattern was impossible to ignore. DeMarcus was released pending review, and when he walked out of the county jail, his mother was waiting beside Pastor Elijah and Maya. No cameras had been invited, but half the town heard about it before dinner. Then came 2 more cases. Then 7. Then 15. Each reopened file loosened another brick in the wall Whitaker had built. Deputy Ryan Hales testified before the state review panel. His voice shook when he admitted he had seen warning signs long before he acted. He did not ask to be praised. He did not ask to be forgiven. He said he had mistaken silence for survival and survival for innocence. That testimony changed something in the younger officers who remained. Some resigned. Some were suspended pending review. A few stayed and cooperated fully, knowing the department they returned to would no longer protect them from accountability. An interim sheriff named Angela Price, a black woman who had spent 22 years with the State Bureau of Investigation, was appointed to lead the office until a special election. On her first day, she took down Whitaker's framed photograph from the lobby wall and replaced it with a plain notice explaining how citizens could file complaints without going through the sheriff's chain of command. It was a small act, but people came by just to see it. At New Hope Baptist, the youth program reopened under brighter lights and tighter records, not because the church had something to hide, but because Elijah wanted every donor, every parent, and every child to know that integrity could survive inspection. The county returned the grant money that had been withheld, and an outside foundation matched it after the story reached Atlanta. Jamal Turner became the first student enrolled in the expanded mentorship program. He did not talk much about the day of his baptism at first. But one afternoon, while helping repaint the fellowship hall, he told Elijah he had decided he might want to become a lawyer. Elijah handed him a paint roller and said, "Then start by learning to listen better than the people who hurt you." Daniel Brooks stayed in Ashford longer than he planned, though never as the hero some people tried to make him. He refused interviews. He corrected anyone who said he had saved the church alone. The evidence was preserved by the people who refused to be scared, he said. The case was built by witnesses. Still, people understood what his presence meant. For years, Whitaker had taught Ashford that power belonged to the man willing to misuse it. Daniel showed them another kind of power, disciplined, lawful, patient, and impossible to bully once the truth was ready. The biggest change was not written in policy, though the policies mattered. It was seen in smaller moments. A patrol car slowed near the south side, and the officer inside waved before moving on. A store owner who had once refused to put up a complaint clinic flyer taped one to the front window himself. At the next county meeting, people who had never spoken into a microphone stood one by one and demanded answers without apologizing for taking up space. And when Pastor Elijah walked through town, people no longer looked at him with pity for what had happened. They looked at him as proof that dignity did not mean weakness, that patience did not mean surrender, and that one church full of witnesses could force an entire system to answer for what it had tried to bury. The first Sunday after the federal letters cleared New Hope Baptist, the church opened its doors before sunrise. No one had planned a special service, but people came early anyway, carrying flowers, coffee, folding chairs, and the quiet need to stand together in a place that had been wounded and had still remained standing. The burn mark near the back storage room had not been fully repaired yet. A strip of fresh paint showed where the hallway wall had been touched up. The office door had a new lock, and above it, the small camera light blinked red, steady and unashamed. Pastor Elijah Brooks arrived at 6:20, wearing a dark suit, polished shoes, and the same gold wedding ring that had carried him through grief, fatherhood, ministry, and the long night when a lie tried to take his name. He stood outside for a moment at the foot of the church steps, looking at the place where the patrol cars had waited, where his congregation had cried, where Sheriff Whitaker had believed humiliation would be the final word. The morning was cool, the air soft with pine and wet grass. Behind him, Daniel stepped from his car in a simple gray suit, no vest, no visible badge, only a son coming to church. Maya arrived a few minutes later with a folder tucked under one arm, though Elijah suspected she would never stop carrying evidence the way other people carried umbrellas. Sister Ruth unlocked the front doors and looked at all three of them. "Well," she said, "are we going to stand outside all morning or let the Lord see we still have work to do?" Elijah smiled for the first time that day and walked in. By the time service began, every pew was full. People stood along the walls. Some had come from the south side. Some from across town. Some were old members. Some had not entered a church in years. Deputy Hales sat near the back, out of uniform, hands folded, eyes lowered until Elijah saw him and gave a small nod. Jamal Turner sat beside his mother in the second row, wearing the same white shirt he had worn for his baptism, freshly washed and pressed. When Elijah stepped to the pulpit, the room grew silent, not with fear this time, but with attention. He placed both hands on the Bible and looked over the faces before him. He saw people who had recorded when they were afraid, testified when they were threatened, and told the truth when silence would have been safer. He saw his daughter, who had turned pain into precision. He saw his son, who had carried power without letting it become pride. And he saw a community learning that justice was not the same as revenge. There are people, Elijah began, his voice low and steady, who believe a lie becomes stronger when it is spoken by someone with authority. They believe a badge can make a falsehood holy. They believe fear can keep a town quiet forever. He paused, letting the words settle into the old wood and stained glass. But truth has a way of waiting. It waits in cameras. It waits in records. It waits in the memory of people who were told no one would believe them. And when the time comes, truth does not need permission to rise. A soft murmur moved through the congregation. Elijah looked toward Jamal. A week ago, a young man came here to be baptized, and men with power tried to turn that moment into shame. Today, we finish what was started. Jamal's mother covered her mouth as her son stood. The church did not erupt. It breathed. Elijah stepped down from the pulpit and walked with Jamal to the baptism pool, moving slowly, giving the moment back the dignity that had been stolen from it. Daniel stood near the rear wall, his eyes bright but controlled. Maya held Sister Ruth's hand. When Elijah lowered Jamal into the water and raised him again, the church finally broke into sound, not anger, not triumph over enemies, but a release of grief and hope carried together. Later, after the service ended and the crowd spilled into the fellowship hall, Elijah remained in the sanctuary alone for a while. He walked down the center aisle, touching the back of each pew as if counting memories. Daniel found him near the front doors. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Daniel said, "You scared me." Elijah looked at his son and nodded. "You scared me first, growing up so quiet. I never knew what you were planning." Daniel laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carried relief more than humor. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it right." Daniel swallowed and looked toward the pulpit. "So did you." Outside, the sun climbed higher over Ashford, lighting the church steps in gold. The town was not healed in a day. No town ever was. Files still had to be reviewed. Cases still had to be reopened. Trust still had to be earned where it had been broken. But something sacred had been restored. Not just Elijah's name, not just the church's reputation, but the belief that ordinary people, standing together with evidence and courage, could make even powerful lies answer. Pastor Elijah Brooks stepped out into the morning with his family beside him and his congregation behind him. The same steps where he had once been led away in cuffs now carried children running toward breakfast, elders greeting neighbors, and a young man drying baptism water from his face. Elijah looked over Ashford, then back at the open doors of New Hope Baptist. The lie had entered loudly, wearing a badge. The truth stayed longer, wearing dignity.